Good afternoon. We're going to give it a second here before we get started. Let people get logged in and connected. Okay, we're going to get started here. Thank you all for joining us today for one of our Lunch and Learns. I'm very excited about this panel. I am Joyce McDaniel, and I serve as Executive Director for the Women's Political Collaborative of Tennessee. I want to first thank Belmont University for partnering with us today on this program and appreciate their continued and always supporting this organization. As a reminder, please remember to keep your videos off and your microphones muted so everyone can pay attention to those folks speaking. And at this time, I want to turn it over to Dean Al Gonzalez with Belmont University.
Thank you. And let me begin by welcoming our audience. Recent events have certainly elevated the conversation about racial equity and civil rights in our society. And, during such times, our nation yearns for leadership, as we all know. And fortunately, during much of our history, men and women of goodwill, integrity, and courage have stepped forward. Corey Tyndall Vance was such a leader. And we're going to have a good discussion today. I'd like to now introduce Larry Woods, who will moderate today's discussion of C.T. Vance and introduce our panelists. Larry Woods is a distinguished civil rights lawyer in Nashville, who was selected as the best lawyer in Nashville by the Nashville Scene, and he has taught constitutional law and civil rights law at Tennessee State University for almost 50 years, unbelievably. TSU selected him as their most outstanding professor in 1998 to deal with his lifelong love of books. Larry and his wife, Sarah Lee, Woods owned Bookwoman Books in Hillsborough Village for 20 years. Larry?
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. You do a great job in leadership yourself with the Belmont Law School and so many other vitally important public issues in our community, and we appreciate your role very much. I'm honored today to be the facilitator for this program about the civil rights work, the human work of C.T. Vivian. He started in the civil rights movement in Illinois, came to Tennessee to further his education at American Baptist, vitally involved in the leadership of the National Sit-In movement, and from there, in alliance with Dr. King and John Lewis and so many others, did the important work in the civil rights movement, not only in Atlanta and Georgia and Florida, but in the Carolinas and on the freedom rides from Alabama to Mississippi and to Parchman Penitentiary. I think at this point, we'd like to show a video, if we may, Joyce, on Selma, Alabama, involving the Reverend C.T. Vivian, and then I'll quickly introduce our panelists.
Your video, audio.
Yeah.
Steve Pfeiffer can give us the audio explanation here at the end. What we're watching is Reverend Vivian confronting Sheriff Jim Clark of Selma, Alabama, 1965, I guess in March. Steve knows these details better than I do. And Sheriff Clark assaulting Mr. Vivian, who's very calmly, very professionally saying, we're here to register to vote. And after the sheriff of the county simply strikes out and knocks Mr. Vivian to the ground, as the book explains, Mr. Vivian's there on the ground thinking, if I don't get up, if I don't continue the struggle by getting up and confronting him, that's going to send a lesson to all the, Mr. Vivian wouldn't have said rednecks, but I will. That's going to send a lesson to all the bad guys that they can stop our nonviolent movement. So let me introduce Steve Pfeiffer, the co-author of Mr. Vivian's memoir and book, It's in the Action, Memories of a Nonviolent Warrior. And also, so I don't have to interrupt much, let me introduce Al Vivian, his son, and Denise Morse, his daughter, who's lived these stories, knows them better than anybody in the civil rights movement. And I should also add, Steve Pfeiffer's also written another book about some of the nonviolence and violence, I guess deaths, in the civil rights movement. What's the title of the other book, Steve?
It's called Jimmy Lee and James, Two Lives, Two Deaths, and the Movement That Changed America. And I'll talk a little about that because that's actually what brought me and Dr. Vivian together.
Good, tell us.
Right now, you want me to start? I'm happy to do so.
Start with Selma or how you came into the story.
Sure. Well, the reason I like to start by showing that video, which you did a very good job of explaining, Larry, is because it's one of the most iconic moments in the history of the civil rights movement. Andrew Young has said, if that confrontation had not taken place and been captured just by chance by the national media that was there and then broadcast around the country, we might not have had a Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I still get chills when I see that and hear it. And it's also important to me to show it because that's the event that brought me to Dr. Vivian 6 or 7 years ago. I was working on a different book at that time called Jimmy Lee and James, about the lives and deaths of two people who participated in the struggle for voting rights in Selma and Marion, Alabama in February of 1965. Jimmy Lee Jackson, an African-American farmer, and Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian minister, white from the North, both of them lost their lives. And Dr. Vivian was so intimately involved in that struggle as well that I wanted to talk to him about that time period. So I tracked him down in Atlanta. We had a conversation. As I've said to the family, you know, I was so thrilled just to be talking to one of my heroes. And then when he called me Doc, I thought that was really special. But then they told me that he called everyone Doc. So it wasn't, you know, quite as special, but still we hit it off. And during the course of several conversations, I learned that he'd never written a memoir or autobiography about his remarkable life. And over a period of time, I persuaded him that maybe as he was getting so much older, he was not over 90 then, that it was really important to memorialize this incredible life, which, as you pointed out, Larry, he was born in Boonville, Missouri, moved to Illinois, Western Illinois, when he was 5 or 6 years old, went to school at Western Illinois University, moved to Peoria, where he was involved in sit-ins in 1947, eventually met his wife, Octavia, the mother of Denise and Al, who in her own right was an activist at that time. And then, you know, he got his calling, came to Nashville, an American Baptist, and then was active in every major stop along the civil rights movement. Birmingham, St. Augustine, Selma. Then he came up north to Chicago. So in his life, I saw really a history of the whole civil rights movement, because he was older than some of the other people that we know from Nashville, John Lewis, Diane Nash, and so forth. He was about 15 years older. So we commenced on the book, and it was just one of the highlights of my professional and personal life. My wife Sharon's a novelist, and she says there are only two reasons to write a book: to save a life or to change the world. And while a lot has changed since the 1960s and the movement, sadly, the events of the last several months and even in recent weeks show us we have a long way to go. So I'm really hoping that our book can lead to a discussion about voter suppression, the role of the church, nonviolent direct action. And I'm hoping that even though he's gone, Dr. Vivian's words that we have left now can continue to change the world. Before I toss it over to Al and Denise a little, I just want to read a little portion from the book that you kind of alluded to, Larry, and that was what Dr. Vivian explained to me was the reason why he got up after being knocked down by Sheriff Clark there. He wrote, "It becomes very clear that we can never allow evil to destroy the forces of righteousness, even when beaten down. I had to get back up because otherwise people would have been defeated by violence. We can never allow violence to defeat nonviolence. There can be no questions unanswered. The depth of the human consciousness must be told. With Jim Clark, it was a clear engagement between the forces of the movement and the forces of the structure that would destroy the movement. It was a clear engagement between those who wished the fullness of their personalities to be met and those that would destroy us physically and psychologically. You do not walk away from that. This is what movement meant. Movement meant that we finally were encountering on a mass scale the evil that had been destroying us on a mass scale. You do not walk away from that. You continue to answer it. It does not matter whether you are beaten. That's a secondary matter. The only important thing is that you reach the conscience of those who are with you and of anyone watching, both the so-called enemy and those who are preparing the battle and anyone else who may be watching." I think that's really profound. And I wanted to ask, Denise and Al were very young at the time of Selma, and Al wasn't even born during the Nashville period, right, Al?
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to know their memories of that time period and what their dad told them about Nashville and Selma.
Well, I was the first, and I was born in Peoria, so was maybe 6 months old when I got to Nashville. But we were there for 6 or 7 years, and I remember the campus. I remember where we lived. Um, I remember a lot of people being in and out, which were probably all the friends in the movement, all the people in the theology school were there together. But I was too young to really know what was going on. And actually, Mom protected us from most of that. Um, yeah, she really did. Even when we lived in Atlanta, and Daddy would appear on the news occasionally. This was, years later. I probably would have been around 10 or so. She just wouldn't allow us to watch the evening news. So Mom and Dad really didn't talk about the movement. You might hear conversations that they had, but you'd meet people who come to the house. When Hosea Williams would come to the house, and Dick Gregory would call the house, and you kind of got to know who these people were when they called. But we really didn't have a strong understanding. Daddy came in on Friday and left on Monday. he was he'd come in, preach a sermon on Sunday, eat Sunday dinner, and he was packing up to leave. So that was most of our remembrance, of my remembrance anyway, of the movement. In fact, I think I was probably might have been a freshman in college before I saw that tape that you just showed. They really pretty much what I remember the most about the movement was just waking up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, and mom would always be sitting in the living room in the dark, looking out the window. She was always looking to see if the house was going to be bombed. So I remember that most of my childhood. She didn't sleep at night, and she didn't have a job. You know, most women didn't work then anyway, but she had 6 kids, so she couldn't. So I remember she would sleep during the day, send us to school, get her sleep in, and then she'd be up all night. And I guess that was the, I don't know, you remember
So for me,
anything else?
what I love about these conversations is even when Denise and I or our other brothers and sisters talk, so I'm the youngest. And so I was way younger than everybody else. So there's so many things that I don't remember that they do, and then things I remember differently from my time frame. So I remember, I didn't know about mom sitting up watching out the window at night. I do remember that mom would not watch the early evening news with us around because she wanted to make sure, actually she would have her friends watch the evening news and then call her and let her know everything's okay. In other words, we didn't see anything happen where CT got injured or anybody that the family knows well got injured or anything. And so then mom would watch the late night news after we went to bed so she could see what was going on. I do remember one time mom was watching the news, or the news was on, and I saw a clip of dad, and it was there was a group being attacked by people who didn't like the protest rally taking place, and someone opened the car door and pushed dad in the car and closed the doors to protect him. And the people were running past the car, and I remember mom looking up and seeing it and immediately walking over and changing the channel. And I remember that, like, why did she change the channel? What was going on with dad? But then it was as if it never happened because she was shielding and protecting us. I remember later when we lived in Chicago, I remember one day walking out the front door with my mother to go somewhere, and someone had placed a large caliber bullet with a note wrapped around it on our doorstep, a threatening note. And we stepped out the door. I'm with it's just me and mom. We step out the door, and she looks down and she sees this big bullet, and she just swoops down, picks it up as if nothing ever happened. And I said, "What was that?" She says, "Oh, nothing." And we went on about our lives. And then later I thought about it. So that was a bullet. And then years and years. I mean, as an adult, I went back and asked mom about that. And she said, "Oh yeah, stuff like that happened all the time. We didn't want you all to know about it." So mom was real good at shielding us to make sure we didn't know what was going on so that we didn't feel any danger. Now, the clip you showed, I remember seeing the clip in the movie Montgomery to Memphis when I was still real young. We went to see that together at the movies as a family. Then I remember the premiere of it we saw. And then I remember at school, young kids said, "Your dad got hit in the head, knocked down the steps on TV." And I was like, "Yeah, and because of that, you get to go to this school. And because of that, your parents get to vote." So I kind of push them off by saying those things. But Denise is so right about how they shielded us from so much. But we got to meet the people of the movement, but we never talked about the movement.
Yeah. And
one thing that I think often gets overlooked, and we tried to write a little about it in the book, is the role that spouses, and in particular wives,
Yes.
played during that time period. Your mom herself, as I noted, had been active in Michigan and trying to integrate a diner there before she even met your dad. And she was the one who urged him to go to seminary when he had some doubts about doing that. And Al has a good story about that, I know. And again, before he went on the Freedom Rides, talking to your mom about it. But can you guys talk a little about the role that women played in the movement?
Well, they played a major part. Not many of them. There were a lot of women who marched with NSCLC and SNCC, but it was a male world, and the men did most of the heavy lifting, but women were always involved, and the wives were absolutely involved. I mean, they were there. Daddy was gone all week, but mom was answering the phone. People didn't have cell phones, so the house was command central. So the movement wives were calling each other and keeping each other informed. And mom spent time integrating. We lived in Atlanta, integrating the Kirkwood area
Yep.
during the day. Making sure we could go to the neighborhood schools. And I remember Hosea Wim's wife and Ab's wife, and they all communicated regularly. They were all broke, and so they would help each other with bills. I remember when Dad was with SCLC, you got paid once a month, and it was a small amount. And Mom would drive us over to get Dad's check because we'd been broke the last 2 weeks. And I think all the movement women helped each other. And then you had or movement wives, and then you had those who actually were there with the men and helping to run SCLC. Uh, and so women were always involved, but it was the men who were up front marching, and the ones you saw on the news. Yeah, but lots of women were beaten during the movement.
And your mom wrote the definitive biography of Coretta Scott King.
Yeah.
Yeah, she did. I think I was in high school then, and Mom loved Coretta
Yeah.
very much and had a great respect for her. And she actually was a good writer, and I think wanted to spend most of her time writing. When we cleaned out the house and the things in it, we found a list of books that Mom had planned on writing. She never got around to it. She was too busy helping Dad um, work in the movement and run and raise 6 kids. So she never got to do all the writing she wanted to, but she was pretty good.
She was very good. And I would add that's another piece of the sacrifice that you had these gifted, talented, courageous women that did not get to live out their dreams because they were helping their husbands in the movement so their husbands could clear the way so that all people of color could live out our full dreams, so we could have our rights. And so there's so much of that they don't get credit for. And I didn't realize the significance of that until I became an adult, because as a kid, it was like, you always saw Dad out in public and Dad was doing this and Dad was doing that. And as a child, I didn't think about the sacrifices made by Coretta, by Mom, by all of them. It was something that just wasn't top of mind, but they made massive sacrifices. And I love the fact that Denise brought up the point that and they were broke. It's funny. People think, people say to me, well, you all grew up with all this money. I'm like, no, the civil rights movement did not pay well. And I often have to make people look at they're looking at modern day. So they'll look at like an NAACP and, they'll say, you see the NAACP Image Awards, corporate sponsors are, and they list all these corporate sponsors. They didn't have corporate sponsors back during the movement. The corporate were totally against the movement. And so it had to be African-American owned businesses primarily, like Herman Russell Construction Company here in Atlanta, who helped finance King and the movement, or Alexander and Alexander Insurance Company, T.M. Alexander Sr. And he and his grandson and I actually went to college together and pledged our fraternity together. But it's that close-knit group of people who were African Americans who had small businesses that were able to contribute somewhat. So when King won the Nobel Peace Prize, he took half the money from the Peace Prize and put it back into his organization to stay afloat. And so people don't think about all of that. So the sacrifices were huge. I also love the fact that you mentioned that in Peoria, Illinois, and in Missouri, they were doing these protests because people also want to act as if the racism was only in the South. And his dad used to jokingly say that, talk about race, it's all South. It's just up South and down South. So, so Illinois and New York, that's up South, Georgia, Mississippi, et cetera, that's down South. But it was the same mentality on race throughout the nation. It was just more vicious and more openly talked about in one region than the other, but it was always there.
Steve, before you go on, and Mr. Vivian and Ms. Morris, I need to interject. Nashville, not only in the beginning days of the civil rights movement in the 50s, I shouldn't say beginning, but in the 50s, we not only had the national leadership of people like C.T. Vivian and the Reverend Jim Lawson and Mr. Bevel and many others. We had many of our leaders were the women. We had Diane Nash, We had Mrs. C.E. Magruder. We had Nona Work. We had Senator Thelma Harper, who just died this week. We had so many women who maybe weren't quite as out front, except for Diane Nash. And I know from hearing you talk and from reading the book, it was true in a lot of these epic situations in the movement. I know when I was in college in Atlanta and would volunteer over at the SCLC office, the women ran that office.
Dolores Wilkinson, Larry. Dolores Wilkinson, Larry.
Yes, Dolores Wilkinson. I shouldn't leave her out, Walter. Thank you. Inez Crutchfield. I mean, the list goes on and on of Nashville people. And I appreciate what both of you, Ms. Morris, Mr. Vivian, are saying, that the people that worked in the movement, the people that supported the movement, understood the leadership of the women and how essential they were. I should have said Joyce Searcy as well on that list of women a minute ago. Joyce Searcy has protected more children in this community and stood up for education in this community more than anybody I know. I'm just going to be in lots of trouble for leaving people out. But I just want to echo and endorse what you're saying, Ms. Morris, Mr. Vivian, about your family and your mother. And that's in the book. I saw that in the book where your father and Mr. Pfeiffer were saying Mrs. Vivian was a central part of the strategy, how much your dad emphasized we've got to be strategic about what we do in the movement. And he would always talk it over with Mrs. Vivian and run it by her and make sure she agreed. They obviously were a heck of a team.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned Nashville, not only because we're speaking to Nashville, because it was such an important moment in the movement. And that march that took place on April 19th, 1960, so almost exactly 61 years ago, we remember April 19th, the bombing of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City in 1995, but that bombing of Alexander Luby's house, the lawyer who was representing the students involved in the sit-ins, was an equally iconic moment in our nation's history, important moment. Led to that march with Dr. Vivian and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette at the front, to City Hall, where they confronted Mayor West. And at that time, 3,000 to 4,000 people. It was the largest march in the contemporary civil rights movement. And then you had Dr. Vivian and Diane Nash on the steps of the City Hall confronting Mayor West. And I think of it as like good cop, bad cop almost, because Dr. Vivian was, by all accounts, kind of in Mayor West's face that day, challenging him. Are you a good Christian? How can you be and sanction this kind of behavior? And then he's calling Diane Nash little lady. It's a really critical moment. Nashville then, within a few weeks, the lunch counters were integrated. Yeah. And it was the first time below the Mason Dixon something like that had happened.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I also related strong to what I think was Miss Morse said a minute ago. Or Mr. Vivian, about the money. And in reading the part of the book about the Freedom Rides in 1961, when the attack by the racists stopped the Freedom Ride in Anniston and Birmingham, basically, and everybody was going to walk away from the Freedom Rides, it was C.T. Vivian and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette and Jim Bevel and the other Nashville student leadership that met here in Nashville, said, no, we can't let this happen. We're going to sign up to go finish the Freedom Rides on the Greyhound bus. And one of the points in the book that really struck me as vivid was, but first they had to raise $900. It was going to take
Right.
at least $900 to transport the students from Nashville to Birmingham and to provide food basically on the bus rides. And they had to argue and plead with the leadership, the adults, the people that had the money to raise $900. And of course, my friend John Sigenthaler finishes that story by saying the Kennedys had called Mr. Sigenthaler, who most of the audience probably knows was the editor of the Tennessean, one of the few newspapers white newspapers to actually cover the civil rights movement and urge its success. And he was a friend of the Kennedy family. And either John or Robert Kennedy called John Sigenthaler and said, we understand these students are going to come to Birmingham. You've got to stop them. They're going to inflame the situation. Dwight Lewis is listening. He knows this better than I do, having worked at the Tennessean and been one of the crusaders for civil rights all his life. And so John Sigenthaler talks to Diane Nash. You've got to call this off. These students are going to die if they go to Birmingham. You're not going to survive this. And Diane Nash looked at John Sigenthaler and said, we all signed our wills last night.
Right.
You know, the white community, people like me, even the supporters of the movement, people like me, I was just a kid then, we didn't understand, I don't think, just how severe it was. I mean, yeah, I knew people got hurt occasionally, but I think for people like Dr. Vivian and his family and the other leadership, especially, the threat of death and threat of violence was a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day a week issue for them, which they were so courageous. You know, that's what doesn't come through in the film clips and videos we watch today of the 60s and 50s, was the sheer personal courage that your father, Mr. Vivian, Miss Morris, had to demonstrate, and your mother as well, every single day while raising a family and protecting them. It's just astounding to me, the courage these people had.
Yeah, me too. It's one thing to be a student and single and not have children and use the courage to get out there and risk your life. I mean, it's extremely admirable. I mean, thank God for those single people who can do it. But when you have 5 kids at home or 6 kids at home, and in Martin's case, 4 kids at home, and there's no money at home. So you know if you die there, your wife and children are just on their own. And those men and some of the women who had children had to make that decision every day. You know, I could leave my children in this world with nothing because that was literally it. No home, as everybody was renting, or we moved every year and a half, every 2 years. No life insurance, it was just oh well. But they knew that we didn't have a future if they didn't do what they had to do.
Yeah.
And we're the kids and still in awe of all of those people and our parents. It's truly
But
amazing.
one, Larry, you've mentioned so many names of people in the movement in Nashville. And one thing that we have in the book is the fact that, Hamilton, the musical, there's a line in there where the Hamilton character marvels at the fact that there are so many amazing revolutionaries and thinkers in one place at one time: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton. But to me, Nashville 1960 was exactly that. Vivian, Nash, Bevel, Marion Barry, James Lawson, Kelly Miller Smith, all those remarkable Lafayette. We got a Lafayette in Hamilton and a Lafayette in Nashville. But all those remarkable people in one place at one time, making a huge difference in the world.
Out of which we get SNCC organized by those young college students, those primarily in Nashville. We get the resumption of the freedom rides. And when Dr. Vivian goes to Parchman State Penitentiary in Mississippi, along with a lot of the other freedom riders, that's really the spur, it seems to me, looking back at the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party starting, at the Mississippi voter registration drive starting. It's going to take years and years and years. And it all comes from this leadership of people in Nashville, primarily at TSU, Fisk, and American Baptist. It is amazing that Nashville, for a long time there in the civil rights movement, was really the headquarters, the meeting room. It was the place where the votes got taken and the issues that mattered got discussed.
The room where it happened.
Truly.
Yes, yes, yes. Maybe what we need is a New York stage play for the Nashville movement.
Absolutely, yeah. One thing I like to discuss with Al and Denise as well is the fact about their dad's life after Selma, when he came up to Chicago, but he was and Al and I have talked about this, no pun intended, but a real visionary in terms of creating things early on that now might seem, like against white supremacy, or for forwarding the education of African American students. So, Al, maybe you can talk a little about some of those ventures that your dad was involved in, after those moments of the civil rights movement that we all remember.
And so, a number of things you say ahead of his time, and one of the things I hadn't thought about until you mentioned this in one of our conversations, the Seminary Without Walls he started, which was before there was such a thing as online training. It was kind of that. It was distance learning, where he took a whole curriculum for a degree and had them on cassette tapes and would sell them out, and people could learn and get a seminary degree without having to go to a specific location. The Seminary Without Walls. So he was like the father of distance learning to a great extent. The beauty of what I get to do now is something that Dad created. The whole, I don't know if I'd say he was definitely, but I would say more than likely the founder of the whole diversity movement. With Basic Diversity, our company, which I have the blessed opportunity to lead now, is the longest serving diversity firm in existence. And Dad started the company just doing these 2-day, he and a gentleman named Charles King created a 2-day race relations seminar, which I have the privilege of doing now. And so Dad was blessed if he got to do 2 seminars a month, and then in 1989, he did the Oprah show, and floodgates opened. And at the time, I was a captain in the Army, and I wasn't thinking about doing this for a living. I mean, this has always been my passion issue. But when I saw Dad on the Oprah show, I was like, whoa, I knew what he did. I didn't know how he did it. And so I called him that night and said, hey, I want to come work for you. And he said, well, you better make sure you can do it before you leave a good job, because just because you're my son doesn't mean you'll have a job. And so I was like, oh, okay. But then, a year and a half later, when my obligation with the military was up, I left and came and started working with Dad. So pretty much, one of the founding fathers of the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, and for it to really branch out into corporate in particular. And then in 1979, prior to the time I'm talking about, in 1979, Dad and Ann Braden started the National Anti-Klan Network, which later became known as the Center for Democratic Renewal. And so everybody in that time thought that the Klan was no longer a threat, that they were, that was old school and it was not going to be around anymore. Well, Dad was paying attention and realized that their numbers were starting to grow, and their numbers did grow. And so now we're looking at that same thing happening. The insurrection on January 6th at the US Capitol was highly loaded with white supremacist group members. They just create new names like the Proud Boys, but it's the same stuff. And the US military and the US law enforcement officers are highly infiltrated by white supremacist groups. And nobody was paying attention to that. For a long time, it was Dad who was paying attention to that. So I would also add to that in 2006, the FBI came out with a report here in the US talking about the rise of white supremacist groups, and that part of their strategy was to infiltrate local law enforcement offices so that they could kill blacks and browns without any, real repercussions to it. And they released a report, and the mistake they made in the report is they didn't say white supremacist groups, they said far right leaning groups, which by the way they are, but then those on the political side, on the right side versus the left, the more conservatives started pushing back at the FBI. How can you say that? Well, you're saying that we're that. They would say, no, we're not saying that at all. So would you say far right leaning? And so because of the wording and the pressure, the FBI shut up and said not much more about it, and not much more was done about it. And then we saw about 9 to 10 years after that, the largest number of unarmed blacks and browns being killed by white cops. It's all of that. But Dad was seeing these things when people were not paying attention to these things. And so it is amazing for me to see some of the things that he did in the past, how now people are starting to connect the dots to the relevance of that. I'm always amazed at how visionary Dad was, and never reached out to get applause for it.
No, he never even talked about it. Actually, right. You left out a few. When when we moved to Chicago, Dad moved us to Chicago. He started he went there because he got funding, I think through the Ford Foundation, maybe, for the first Black think tank, which was the Urban Training Center.
That's right.
And Dad was always focused on the ministry. Remember, the movement survived because Black churches paid their pastors to go out and run the movement. They had a salary, most of them, because no one could stop the church from paying them, so they could not work. And so Daddy was real focused on training ministers. So he started the Urban Training Center in Chicago, and then went on to realize that the gangs were fighting each other. So he got them to come together to fight the unions for jobs for Black people.
Right.
And, then went to Seminary Without Walls. But he was always, and then he started Upward Bound. People don't realize that it was actually vision, and it came out of the movement, and then the government picked it up, made it Upward Bound. But it was for training children so that they would have an education in the Deep South. So he was always thinking of, his mind was always working. He'd just be sitting in a chair and his brain was working. And so, Daddy, what's up? I've got this idea. And usually, being kids, we just go, oh no, because we know we'd have to take an hour to hear this new idea. But he always had them. He was always thinking forward. And he couldn't help himself. He's brilliant.
Yeah.
And it was always to help people. That's all he cared about, was
always helping people. Always. It was never about himself. Even to the point when Dad passed, and at the funeral, when John Lewis's son, was there, I walked over and thanked him, for being there. And he says, I would not have missed this. Your father was my dad's mentor. And I'm going, what? I never knew that John Lewis considered Dad his mentor.
Yeah.
So this talks about how humble Dad is, because if John Lewis considered me his mentor, or everyone on the planet would know it. I would start every speech by saying, hi, I'm John Lewis's mentor. Thank you very much, But Dad never talked about that. We didn't even know that, because he didn't talk about those things. It was in the action. His whole thing was, we got to always be doing something to progress. It's in the action. So that's why, when Steve asked him about you've never done a memoir before? Because for Dad, it was always in the action. Always.
At the same time, though, maybe you can talk to me a little about, this was a man who was a voracious reader and appreciator of literature, and a collector of African-American works dating all the way back to colonial times. And there's going to be a library in Atlanta soon, we hope, right? Houses over 6,000 volumes. Maybe you can just talk about his love of literature and collecting of books to an audience of book people here today.
And both our parents loved books, and they would well, they collected when we were children whatever they could, any books they came across. But after we were all out of the house, they hop in the car and drive across country and stop at bookstores,
Yeah.
just small bookstores, and they come back with the car loaded with books. We'd have to help them unload, and we didn't know where this was going, but eventually they ended up with 6,000 volumes that we've all inventoried, and many go back to the 1700s, and he's got them signed, Langston Hughes books signed, and I mean, it just goes on and on. Just, I think probably 30% of them are signed, and by very well-known people. And what's the one I'm trying to think of, Al, from the 1700s? The first book
You know,
written by
he had a
Phyllis
Phyllis
Wheatley,
Wheatley signed book.
Yes.
He
yeah,
had a signed Benjamin Banneker almanac.
Yeah.
I mean, he loved to read. Later, when I started working with Dad, and we travel and go to places, as soon as we get to a different city, he's like, oh, wait a minute, we gotta go to this bookstore. Okay, because he would go to the rare antiquated bookstore in every major city he went to, and because he had to find these books, and that's who he was. Always.
Yeah, he knew what he was looking for when he
Always knew exactly what he was looking for, and would have researched. I think I can find it in that city.
Yeah. Yeah, so they had over 6,000. Our dad had 6,000 when he passed, and right now they're in storage. Um, but there is supposed to be a library in Atlanta, the CT and Octavia Vivian Museum and Archives Library, and we're hoping that we've been working on this for a while, but we're hoping that they'll get enough funding to get the building put up, so we'll have somewhere for the books. But he has a beautiful
Denise is
library.
modest. She's been doing most of that work. So she's put a lot of work into this. And I would also add, I love the fact that Dad has consistently stressed it will not be the CT Vivian Library, it'll be the CT and Octavia Vivian Library, because of all the sacrifices Mom made and because of her help and dedication. And they were a true partnership. And that was something that he was firm on. No, this was not me, this was us.
Yeah. And
one last thing I want to point out about this book is that we all feel very strong about the need to get Dr. Vivian's story to young people. And it couldn't be more timely with efforts now at voter suppression to know the sacrifices that folks like he made in Octavia and the family for so many years, and undertaken an effort to donate books to high school students or college students in the cities that Dr. Vivian had some relationship to. So all the students graduating from high school this year in Boonville, Missouri, where he was born, are a copy of the book. Similarly, in Selma and Marion, and Bill King here in Nashville is giving a book to every graduating student from American Baptist. And it's just an effort we really feel strongly about to get a whole new generation about Dr. Vivian.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult for a lot of white people, and I'm sure for young Black, brown, API people, to truly appreciate what life was like for minority folks 50 years ago in this country, or heck, 30 years ago in this country. You know, we're all reminded of a lot of these issues when we see jury verdicts like we got this week in Minnesota. You know, isn't it great that a cross section of Minnesota, 12 strangers came together and affirmed and ratified exactly what all of us were thinking, that we've got some really bedrock issues about how people get treated by the government, by people in power, by people who are different from each other. And I always worry, having lived through a lot of this kind of stuff, like some of you, I always worry that I'm afraid the media and too many people see this as winning the war. We won this good verdict in Minnesota. The war's over. We don't need to worry about any of this anymore. And all of us know better if we stop and reflect on it and think, no, this is just one more battle in a long, long 4-century struggle, certainly 50-year struggle. And I think the media at times, and I'm part of that media, I'm not just criticizing strangers. I think the media at times guilty of just focusing on what's happening right now today. I guess that's part of their job. Whereas what Ms. Morris and Mr. Vivian and you, Mr. Pfeiffer, have been saying is it's a long range movement that requires so much joining in, buying in, support from everybody. I guess the other thing that troubles me from what I've read in the book and have heard several of you mention today is, I know Mr. Vincent was quoted in an article I looked at, talking about how Dad believed in two things, the Constitution and the Bible. And he used those two factors, those two things, not only to guide him in life, but in shaping, focusing how he dealt with the enemy, the folks that didn't care, the folks that weren't paying attention, et cetera. And what troubles me is we had another movement person here in Nashville, a guy named Reverend Will Campbell, who died a few years ago. Reverend Campbell helped form SCLC, worked closely with most of the leadership we've talked about today. And Reverend Campbell, he and Reverend Lawson always bothered me. Lawson would challenge me not to be so involved in politics, that was the wrong way to address these problems. And Reverend Campbell would say, what are you doing for those rednecks? What are you doing for those pride boys, those 3%ers, those oath keepers? What are you doing for them, Larry? And I don't want to hear that. They're the bad guys. I'm not worried about the bad guys. But obviously, if biblical teachings, religious points of view come into it, I guess I am supposed to worry about the bad guys, aren't I? And reach out to them. And I don't do that. And that's my failing. And I guess that's the only ultimate solution, isn't it? We can't just banish all the bad guys to some Pacific island and forget about them. And that's why I truly appreciate some of the points you're making in the book and the life of Dr. Vivian. He was a constant thinker. He was always strategizing about the next step and the next event and how are we going to reach out to more and more and more people. And I know a lot of our listeners today are the kind of people who have been active in leadership in various movements and various events, all of which really have that bedrock. We've got to reach out to everyone. We've got to get everyone to understand the humanity of people. And I don't know, I feel like a lot of the fervor and energy that the civil rights movement brought to those kind of issues is missing nowadays. And I'm unsure what to do about it or what to try to do about it. So I think my question to you is, and I see your hand up, Mr. Vincent, so tell me, what do you think? And what would your father have thought about it?
So one, Dad would say, yes, you have to try to reach out to everybody, but Dad would also say, focus your attention on those who are more likely to help create that tipping point to get everything done. But Dad always talked about, when he talked about the Constitution and the Bible, he was talking about using the two things that find out what people say they value and then get them to see how what their actions are not lining up with those values. And so the way they changed America was saying, white America's view set, their value set was Constitution and the Bible. He says, hey, this is what you value, then let's see that in action. And so if you find out what people value and hold them accountable for their actions based on that, how their actions are not lining up to that, that's how you get them on board. By saying, hey, you value Christianity, then we value the Bible too. And the Bible says, love thy neighbor as thyself. You're not doing that. So if you believe that, why are you doing X, Y, and Z? Hey, you say you believe in this Constitution? We do too. The Constitution says we're all entitled to certain rights and freedoms, but you're denying those rights and freedoms. So do you believe in the Constitution or do you not? And so right now, to the broader question, how do we get everybody on board to change this? I think the biggest solution, we need to start teaching American history, because in the school systems, we don't teach American history. We teach American mythology. And so as a result, you can get to be a grown, in fact, very old white American and never know the realities of American history. And so when there are new voter suppression laws, like we see right now, just passed here in Georgia and about to, the plan is there are currently, at last count, 108 different pieces of legislation in 47 different states being pushed to try to take back voting rights, to suppress the vote, primarily in communities of color. And the reason why that can be done, and people say it's not being done, is because we don't know American history. If we taught real American history, and people can say, wait a minute, this is the same thing they did back in the 50s. Wait a minute, this is what they did in the 30s, because it would be blatantly obvious to people. But because we've excluded real American history, people don't see it coming when it comes. And it's so blatant, it's so obvious. And we've got, if we say we believe in democracy, we've got to push for democracy. Because until the Voting Rights Bill was signed into law in 1964, we were not a democracy. The democracy is about people selecting their government leadership via the vote. If millions of people were denied access because of their race or their gender, that was not democracy. By textbook definition, that was hypocrisy, calling yourself one thing when you're something else. Well, right now, we're about to go right back to that same thing. And it's what fascinates me is this goes back to the Constitution and the Bible, is that the people that I see who are so, we're pro-Bible are the ones supporting those who are pushing these pieces of legislation to take away people's rights to vote. If you believe in justice and equality, then why are you supporting that? Or why are you silent? Just as Martin Luther King Jr. said way back in the 60s, if the church in America is the light of the world, it must be the tail light, because it ain't leading nothing. And that's where we are. We have the church sitting silent. Let me be real clear on that, and hope this doesn't offend anybody, because Black churches are talking about this. We have the white church sitting silent while ungodly acts are being done to thwart democracy. And if we don't all reach out and leverage everybody, it goes back to what you're saying, it's going to take everybody, and we can't forget any voices. But the easiest way to make sure all voices know what's going on is to teach real history. And we're just not doing that. We're trying to keep dominant group members comfortable while taking away rights from non-dominant groups. And when I say dominant, non-dominant, I'm not just talking about race, whites and people of color. I mean, for people in the LGBTQ community versus the straight community, for people, women versus men, for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we're not really teaching the reality of what our history has always been, we're going to be continually doomed to repeat what we've always done before. And until all the voices clearly stand up and say, if we believe in democracy, let's push democracy. If we believe in this, let's push that. But we can't keep playing this game, because the rest of the world is watching. The United Nations is now making statements against America's voting system. I mean, let that sink in.
Thank you. That's a great closing statement, I think, for all of us. Our time's up. I want to thank Mr. Pfeiffer, Mr. Vivian, Ms. Morse. I want to thank Belmont University. I want to thank Joyce McDaniel, who's on my list of great women in Nashville. You've done a great job with these programs, Joyce. Please keep it up. I want to thank everybody who's participated today. These programs are important for the very reasons Mr. Vivian just explained. Stay healthy, stay safe out there. Keep up the good work. Joyce, are you ready?
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Keep up with our website for our next program coming up, discussing drug courts and mental health. Have a great day. Thank you.
All. Thank you,
Bye.
Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, Joyce.